Good afternoon and welcome back to Panel 2, Networks and Scientific Diplomacy. This panel will be chaired by Emily Pawley, who is the Walter E. Beach, 56, Professor of Sustainability Studies and Associate Professor of History at Dickinson College, where she teaches environmental history and the history of science. Her first book, The Nature of the Future, Agriculture, Capitalism, and Science in the Antebellum North, came out in 2020. For the last few years, she and fellow historian of science, Alexandra Huey, have been co-organizing a collaborative volume, The Historian's Handbook for Saving the World. It's a really great title. Responding to the climate emergency, with more than 70 other historians. It is forthcoming from MIT in the spring and will be open access. Emily?
Thanks so much for that introduction, and I'm delighted in turn to introduce this fascinating panel on networks and scientific diplomacy. So I'm just going to introduce all our panelists in turn, and then we'll turn it over to them, and then I'll have a brief comment and some questions, and we'll turn it over to you. So you have a responsibility coming. Our first paper is by Mike Guenther. Sorry, paper doesn't do that. Mike Guenther is an associate professor at Grinnell College, where he teaches courses on the history of science, technology, and the environment, and chairs the interdisciplinary program in science, medicine, and society. He's currently working on a book project about the politics of science in the Anglo-Atlantic world of the 18th century, entitled Science and Civic Culture, The Politics of Knowledge in the Age of Improvement. Portions of that research have appeared in various articles that explore topics ranging from the politics of maple sugar, I'm excited about this, to Arctic exploration to intelligence networks in revolutionary London. And his paper is entitled Tale of Two Jacobins, Scientific Networks and Revolutionary Politics in the 1790s. Second, we have Ellen R. Cohn, who is editor-in-chief of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin and senior research scholar in the Department of History at Yale University. She joined the Franklin Papers in 1979 when the team was commencing work on Franklin's diplomatic mission to France, and she has directed the project since 1999. She's written and lectured widely on various aspects of Franklin's views and activities, including science, diplomacy, his literary essays, his musical life, and the private press and type foundry he established in France during the American Revolution. Third, we have Anna Toledano. Anna Toledano works in and on museums. Her academic research focuses on imperial natural history collecting in 18th century Spain and Spanish America. Her most recent publication, Natural Things in Early Modern Worlds, is an illustrated, edited volume on early modern nature studies. Anna is the executive director of Los Altos History Museum in Los Altos, California, and serves as an associate editor of the Journal of the History of Collections. She holds a PhD in the history of science from Stanford University and an MA in museum anthropology from Columbia University. I have to say, I wanted to check to make sure I was audible at the beginning of this, but I'm going to check in the middle because I forgot to do it at the beginning. Am I audible? Yes. Awesome. All right. Her paper is entitled Shipping and Statecraft, Valentín de Foronda, Guinea Grass, and the Decline of Spanish Colonial Power in the Americas. Jessica Lepler is our last speaker. She's Associate Professor of History at the University of New Hampshire. Her first book, The Many Panics of 1837, People, Politics, and the Creation of a Transatlantic Financial Crisis, which came out from Cambridge in 2013, won the James H. Broussard Best First Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. With Emily Conroy-Krutz, she co-founded Scheer's second book writer's workshop. In 2023 to 2024, she served as Central American Visiting Scholar at Harvard University's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Her second book, Canal Dreamers, The Epic Quest to Connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the Age of Revolutions, was published by UNC Press on August 26th in 2025. And her paper is Dreams of Canals and Climate Change, Citizen Science at the End of the Age of Revolutions. Right, Mike?
All right, thank you so much. to the organizations that have sponsored this, the staff that have worked so hard to put this together, and to my fellow panelists and to you, the audience, for being here. I'm really excited to be at today's conference for many reasons, not least the specific focus, thinking about science and society in the age of revolution. And I'm going to look at the political dimensions of that. Let's see. Do you know how the clicker works? Sorry. What's that? There we go. Okay. Thank you. So I want to start my talk the way I started my paper, focusing on a beleaguered John Adams in the fall of 1798, and his correspondence with his Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, who was just warning of all of these threats emanating from the kind of world of science. He starts off in letters complaining about General Victor Collot, who's leading this naturalist, quote-unquote, expedition through the Western Territories, which is really kind of a secret mission by the French crown to wrest that region into their orbit. Pickering says, while you're at it, why don't we deport Citizen Adet, Pierre Auguste Adet? And I should mention that at the bottom of the slide is the Alien Friends Act, which expires at the end of Adams' term. You're probably familiar with the Alien Enemies Act that is in the news all the time today, but the Alien Friends Act had been passed that spring and allows the president to deport any aliens of friendly countries for any reasons whatsoever. So he starts making a list. He says, let's round up Adet, who is a disciple of Lavoisier, a famous chemist, but is really enmeshed in the networks right here at the American Philosophical Society of cosmopolitan radicals, French emigres, scientists. He says, while you're at it, I think Joseph Priestley should be deported. So should Thomas Cooper. Yes, I see a thumbs up at the Priestley. So he's got this list of all of these radicals that are kind of conspiring, partly in the world of science, partly in the world of politics, to engage in these kinds of pursuits. And most worrying of all is George Logan. George Logan is a disciple kind of Ben Franklin, trained by him, an American-born scientist, agronomer. And that summer, he heads out with what people thought was a kind of agronomic, kind of scientific expedition to France, but turns out really is meant to be a kind of diplomatic coup, to go to negotiate directly with the French government, which had expelled America's ambassadors kind of de facto by insisting that they pay a bribe in the kind of XYZ affair. And at the top banner here, you see the slogan of the Federalist Party that fall, kind of millions for our defense, not a cent for tribute. And so they're basically, the countries are moving towards war. There's no diplomatic ties. And George Logan, probably sent by Priestley and Adet and all of these kinds of figures, is off to France to go negotiate directly with the French Directory. And in that climate, and the last kind of straw, Adams gets word that the French Directory would like to set up closer diplomatic and scientific ties, and so they're planning to send Pierre Dupont to America along with a team of scientists to maybe set up a sister scientific academy somewhere in America. And so Adams pens this letter that I think is really evocative of this moment of a kind of Adams felt besieged by the world of science. And so I'll read it. He says, I shall not be guilty of so much affection to regard to science as to be very willing to grant passports to Dupont de Nemours or any other French philosophers in the present situation of our country. I really begin to think, or rather to suspect, that learned academies, not under the immediate inspection and control of the government, have disorganized the world and are incompatible with social order. Kind of strong words, and I have a cartoon from James Gilray that gets at this view that Adams is not alone in holding, that scientists here kind of portrayed as alchemists in their cabinet of curiosity are dreaming up ethereal visions, that science is providing a cover for this realm of radicals, but more importantly, providing a conduit, networks that kind of allow them to move around the Atlantic way too freely. So that leads to the Logan Act, which I think is one of the more controversial and interesting pieces of legislation in this period of repression. It makes it illegal for citizens. It comes on the heels of George Logan's success. When he comes back, they pass an act that says American citizens cannot, in private capacity, negotiate with governments or petition governments or hold correspondence with governments over policy issues. It's illegal. It's still on the books today and is invoked in political campaigns all the time. But what I'm interested in looking at today and thinking about in my project is the way it draws very bright lines between what it views as legitimate politics, which has to be conditioned by the state and take through normal institutions and channels of the state, versus what it deems illegitimate politics, private affairs, private correspondence, clamping down on what the 18th century would have called, to put it in those terms, politics within doors and politics out of doors. And that's particularly ironic or surprising given how much the American Revolution's success depended on politics out of doors, the world of, whether it's the kind of Sons of Liberties or all these kind of private associations, subscription campaigns, boycotting, just a realm of massive organization that had succeeded in the American Revolution, but by the Federalist view of the 1790s is a dangerous cauldron of democratic politics. Who are these private people? They can vote. Who are these private people to form together as cabals, as organized clubs, to correspond with one another, to create petition campaigns? They should move through the organized democratic channels of voting and of petitioning their administrator, but not on their own. I'd point out here, you'll see David Rittenhouse on the left, one of the key architects of the Democratic Republican clubs that were formed in the 1790s. And most of the leaders of those clubs had roots in the APS or the roots of science. And the caption shows him talking about, oh, if we only had a government like they have on Saturn. George Logan isn't in here. Yeah, and he gave a speech to the Democratic clubs, basically in that vein, talking about there's a cosmic order. It's very Newtonian kind of Whig, kind of what they would have called physico-theology in the early 18th century, about God created a particular order of the universe, and it extends by a great chain down to the political order that needs to mirror it. But I wanted to point out that while Logan is not in this cartoon, he was one of the co-founders of these Democratic clubs. And I think for today's talk, it's very important. I didn't mention the paper, but he's the one who sets up the committees of correspondence for these Democratic clubs. It's scientists that know how to set up committees of correspondence and to create kind of networks of connections. So today, what I want to do with my remaining time is to look at, I've brought to you this Logan affair, which I think as historians of science and thinking about science and its connection to revolution is really important to think through. And I want to juxtapose it with a moment that's less well known. I call it kind of a cause célèbre, but this moment in 1792 in Britain where there was a kind of Jacobin mission of James Watt Jr. So this is the son of the steam inventor of fame, and Thomas Cooper. And I'll talk a little bit about them and why they are seen as embolizing the world of science, or epitomizing it, sorry. And I'm going to kind of try to explore how they use scientific networks to engage in the kinds of transnational politics and diplomacy that drove people like Adams, or in this case, Burke, rises to the House of Commons and singles them out and creates a huge national controversy about this mission, which leads to a host of repressive laws that are very similar to what happened in America in the 1790s. So I think these two episodes next to each other can help us kind of think about why science was seen as radical, what was particularly revolutionary about it. And here we have a picture of one of Priestley's sons being presented to the National Assembly. But this idea of, we want to be thinking about the kind of transnational, the cosmopolitan webs of radical politics that come from science and then get mobilized in order for politics here, new kinds of politics. Now, I did mention about the speech here. I'm going to slip through the slide just to say that I could give a talk about the ideological connections between science and politics, and they're there and important. But what I'm more interested in is the politics, and by that I mean the practice. How do people learn to organize projects and to mobilize people and to engage in forms of collective action? I think an age of revolution is both an age of dissent and disagreement, but you have to mobilize people. You have to engage in new kinds of collective action. And the 17th century had lots of rebellions, lots of revolts. I think what separates the age of revolution more is the ability to create new networks, to create new coalitions, to speak across geographic, social, and religious divides. And I feel that looking at the world of science is one place to understand where that came from. So it was mentioned I'm working on a larger project about how several decades worth of creating all these kinds of clubs, library societies, public hospitals, campaigns for street lighting, campaigns for agricultural reform. These are projects where you have to raise money, you have to deal with cantankerous individuals and dissent. If any of you have worked in nonprofit or civic organizations, you know it's difficult to organize, and you also know what it's like to have that training and experience of learning how those skills. And so I'm looking at how scientific activities provide a training ground for new kinds of mobilization, new kinds of politics in that form. So let me focus on this moment in 1792. We have a print here, a satirical print of Joseph Priestley sitting down at the table with Tom Paine. And this was a really tense moment in Britain in the spring of 1792. There's an anxiety over an explosion of clubs and societies that are formed. I think the Home Secretary talks about an indecent tendency to associate, is how he puts it. But they're just forming like mushrooms. All of these clubs, they're often called like societies for political information, the Society for Constitutional Knowledge, or sometimes just patriotic societies. They had many names. But I want to flag, because I'm going to talk a little bit today about how they emphasize this theme of modeling themselves almost on scientific societies, that they're in the business, the knowledge business of information, gathering material, exchanging. They're all about committees of correspondence to connect to each other. So we have that movement going on. We have the Priestley riots that had happened just the summer before, partly why I show this cartoon, but also to emphasize the growing public perception that rational dissent or non-conforming religion, political radicalism, and science are kind of woven all together in growing ways to the British public. For those that support it, that's a good thing. For those like Burke, who are conservatives that oppose it, it's a dangerous kind of thing. And then you have Tom Paine kind of releasing the rights of man that is just explosive and electrifying at this particular moment here. And I've got a few images. I won't spend a lot of time talking about them. If you're familiar with 1780s Britain, you're familiar with its amazingly rich graphic culture of satirical prints that America doesn't have quite the same. But I think all of these prints get at a very important idea, which is in the spring of 1792, there's this image that you need spectacles, or we have this image of Burke sniffing out Richard Price. On the surface, things are okay. Everyone's it's moderate reform being proposed. But under the surface, there's a secret cabal working of Jacobins to kind of lay the groundwork to overthrow king and church and country. And so people are primed in the public to imagine that there are these networks, underground networks that need to be sniffed out, which is why this mission, and I'm going to talk about the people involved in it, I think resonated so powerfully, why it became a cause célèbre that people wanted to talk about. And I had mentioned James Watt Jr., I'll just call him Watt from now on, but he really stood as a face of, some of you may have heard of the slide mentions the Lunar Society, so this group of kind of industrialists and reformers and dissenters and scientists that meet in Birmingham. Their children are trained really explicitly to be like the 2.0 version of their adults. So Watt, I talked in the paper about how Watt is sent all around Switzerland, all around Germany, all around France to work and train with all the great scientists of the age. His father knows that networks matter and connections matter, and he's primed to be involved in civic reform and public campaigns. And the same is true with Bolton's kid, with Wedgwood's kid. So I think in a way that we won't remember today, at the time they're seen as like training the next generation to assume this new mantle of civic reform and science. Here. And so I talk about why the public would have seen Watt in a particular way and why he appeared that way to Edmund Burke, why he singled him out in particular. And then I talk in the paper a bit about Watt's role after his training in science, how he immerses himself in the associational life of Manchester, where he goes to settle. Because he's so well connected, he gets appointed to be the secretary of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. And I'm just going to take a moment to aside to say the role of the secretaries in these organizations are really important, and the way people move from being a secretary of, like here at the APS, Charles Thompson, secretary of the APS, also secretary of the Continental Congress. Like, you just see these people move because they're the ones that know how to correspond, how to organize people, how to launch projects. And so I think Watt's role at that Manchester institution is really important. While he's there, he starts to meet these circles of scientists and political reformers. I'm going to talk more about a couple of them, Thomas Walker and especially Thomas Cooper, who goes with him to France as well. Yeah. So, and let me just mention, so they're at this scientific society. They decide that they want to go on a mission to France to kind of build social connections, but especially scientific connections. They're going to go meet with Lavoisier and Berthollet and all of these kind of French chemists, because all of the people that you see on the screen here, and Watt Jr. included, are involved in the fustian and the other dye trades, bleaching, things like that. And so they show up in texts all the time about the history of science and industry. So they're part of this campaign originally is pitched as kind of like George Logan. They're going to France to build better ties. Part of it's commercial and business oriented, to open up trade between some of the different firms here. But then part of it is always going to be political. They're interested in going to France and to meeting with some of the French leaders of the Girondin faction and later the Jacobin faction, and they're particularly interested in seeing the clubs, the constitutional clubs that become the kind of called the Jacobin clubs in France there. And one of the things I focus a bit on the paper, I'll just say briefly here, is that one of the things I find interesting is why do the Jacobins take these two young British men seriously? And there are lots of other British travelers, fellow travelers, that kind of say that they're friends of liberty and humanity and science, and they show up in France. And they're treated politely, but they're not escorted into the halls of the Jacobin Club and made a public spectacle the way Cooper and Watt would be, and I'll talk about it in a moment. And so I really think it matters who's behind them and who they represent. So they come with letters of introduction from Joseph Priestley. Thomas Cooper, although not remembered today, Burke writes about him a lot. He's seen as the up-and-coming radical. He's seen as Priestley's kind of disciple, kind of blending Reformed religion, science, political radicalism together. And so they arrive in France and are allowed to give an address to the Jacobin Club. Then they turn this into a large public spectacle. They have a festival where they attend as representatives of Britain. All the addresses are printed out in the public. And it becomes this huge thing that's carried in the British press. They're celebrated by reform circles, and Burke has had too much at this point. And so he rises in the House of Commons and figures, I think he realizes this is a perfect wedge issue to divide the country. Like these two radical dissenting scientists off on a secret mission, forming a cabal in France, is exactly the kind of thing I can use to discredit reform in Britain. And so I won't go into all the details, but I will point out that there are just a series of acts being passed. The Treasonable and Seditious Practice Act, the Seditious Meetings Act, Britain has its own Aliens Act. There's a whole kind of repression that falls from it. And like I was kind of mentioning with Logan, a lot of it does revolve around science, and I won't read all the quotes here. In fact, I'll be wrapping up in a second, but this is Thomas Cooper's response when Edmund Burke singles him out and when the seditious proclamation comes forward. And I'll just kind of point out the language that's underlined. He says, what is wrong with corresponding with other people? Like, we are building political knowledge. We are building political information. Politics is a science. And there's no reason why clubs in England and clubs in France can't correspond, can't work together, can't form alliances, any more than the Royal Society would be banned from corresponding with Swedish academies or philosophical. And I've noticed increasingly when you look at the language from this time period, people do really pitch most of these clubs as kind of like philosophical academies, as places that are there to build knowledge and exchange and a kind of enlightenment program. So George Logan, just briefly, I'm going to say, kind of paraphrase some of the things I mentioned in the paper, that his mission to France was built on his scientific connections and ties that he had going back to his days in Edinburgh, where he was a doctor, and he was tied into the whole network of John Fothergill and Franklin, and he spent a lot of time in the clubs of Edinburgh and saw them as probably the most worthy thing of his education there. He comes back to America and becomes involved in a really, I think, innovative program that was often forgotten to create county-level agricultural societies and clubs. He's not as enamored with the big urban elite-run improvement society. He's like, every county needs to have a club. They need to be linked by correspondence. And in his public calls for this, he talks about the civic dimension of this. Wouldn't it be great if every farmer learned how to debate, learned how to have questions, learned how to write letters and start campaigns? And so he kind of embodies all the kind of themes I'm talking about how this kind of promotion of useful knowledge and the politics of science can lay a groundwork for political radicalism. Stent in his home is a really interesting phenomenon of it becoming a kind of salon-like culture. I will put in a plug that they're taking tours, right? The APS has tours, the Revolutionary City on Saturday, 10:30 of Stenton. So you can go see, as the Hamilton musical would say, the room where it happens. You can see Stenton there. But I make the claim in the paper, I will stand by it, that I think Logan is one of the most well-connected scientists in America in the 1790s, even though he never shows up in the history of science books, because it's not about his ideas, it's about his connections. He's incredibly connected at Stenton, where he and his wife worked to make ties with French, Swiss, German, Dutch scientists. And I'll end just by saying part of the project that I'm working on now and part of the paper is about mapping out George Logan's networks. How does he, like Cooper and Watt, how does he go to France and how does he get doors open that astonish people like Adams? And luckily, Adams had paid spies, or the American consuls had paid spies following along. So we know a lot more about what he was doing, who he was meeting, how he was working those things than others. And so it's very much a story of these kind of scientific networks mobilized in radical ways. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I apologize for not being in my place at the proper time. We had a little technical issue. Lower the mic. Good? How many of you read the material that was circulated in advance? Aha. A few. That's fine. You will have seen that I did not submit a full paper. What I did was to submit, and the rest of you are welcome to go look at it later if you are so moved. I gave more or less a background, a framework, an introduction to the particular moment that my paper is going to focus on, which is the period in the fall of 1785 when Benjamin Franklin comes back to America after 9 years in France. Probably all of you know, but I'll just repeat for general purposes that Franklin was sent to France in 1776, sent by Congress to try to win the French government over to the cause of the revolutionaries. And he was, as you know, brilliant and extremely successful, and was so valuable that Congress wouldn't let him come home when the peace treaty was signed. They insisted, over Franklin's protests, that he stay another 2 years. So although the peace treaty was signed in 1783, Franklin wasn't allowed to come home until the summer of 1785, by which time he was really tired, old, discouraged. I might even go so far as to say depressed, but that's another issue. He wasn't sure anybody would remember him. He kind of had this fantasy of if he survived the trip, then when he got home, he would have a richly deserved retirement, playing with his grandchildren and doing science. But that was not to be, because within 24 hours of stepping foot on the quay here in Philadelphia, he was pounced upon by both political parties. There were two vibrant political parties who simply hated one another, and the rhetoric had gotten even more inflamed and difficult as time went on, and the state's government was completely dysfunctional. So everyone begged him to run for the office of what was called president of the Supreme Executive Council, which we can kind of understand as governor of the state. And he does. He wins, and he stays in office for 3 years. Meanwhile, he also, upon returning to Philadelphia, renews his presidency of the APS. So those are the two things that are background for this story. You see on the screen Franklinia alatomaha, the famous shrub that John Bartram and his son William discovered on one of their expeditions in Georgia. I'm not going to dwell on this plant, but I want to tell a little bit about the history of its discovery, because that will help me make a point that I think is really important for us to keep in mind. The Bartrams came across this shrub in the late fall. I think it was 1765, I may be wrong about that, but the key point is that they were traveling, I think in October, and they came across a shrub that they didn't recognize. They thought it kind of looked like a gordonia, but they couldn't be sure. Years later, William Bartram, the son, returned to that area, retraced some of their roots, and was lucky enough, by virtue of the time of year that he happened to be there, he was lucky enough to see this shrub in bloom. He was there in the middle of the summer. Franklinias bloom in mid to late summer. So eventually, he was able to gather seeds, bring them back to his family botanic garden, propagate them, and the Bartrams were able to study this plant throughout its entire life cycle. And it was only through that close observation that they realized that this was something that they felt quite sure was different. It deserved a genus of its own. And that's why it, in fact, remains in a class of its own. There is only one Franklinia, and that is Franklinia alatomaha. This thing. I owe my knowledge of this slide to Patrick Spiro, who used it a couple of years ago on this podium. It's in the library of the APS. I hope you'll agree with me that it's absolutely fantastic. This is a drawing of a field naturalist. Patrick wasn't quite sure who it was, might be Michaud, might not. What I want to stress is that identifying plants in the field is really, really difficult. I grew up in a family of bird watchers. As a child, I would go around with my parents, and I'm nearsighted. Spotting birds is hard for me. They flit around, they hide behind foliage. If you spot them, you're lucky, and you're even more lucky if you can afford a pair of really good quality field glasses. To me, identifying birds is difficult. And years ago, I assumed plants, I'm a gardener, they're easy. They don't go anywhere. They stay just where they are. They're rooted to the ground. So What's so difficult? The problem is that, as any of you know who are botanists, a plant cannot be identified truly, scientifically, unless it's observed throughout its entire life cycle. A cardinal, once it reached maturity, looks pretty much the same. It lives out its life, it's red, you can understand it. Plants, when they grow, the leaves can change. If you see a seedling, the leaf will very likely look very different from the way the leaf will look when it's mature, some number of months later. The stems can change. Even on the same plant, as I discovered last year, a stem can be different in the lower portion than on the upper portion. All of these characteristics are essential in trying to identify one species from another. So barks of trees will change the older they get and so on. So if you come across in the wild a immature plant or even a fully developed plant, unless you see it when there are flowers and when you can examine the seeds, chances are you're not going to be able to give a positive identification. Now, add to that the fact that in the 18th century, naming plants was pretty much a hodgepodge. People gave names to plants in their local areas, and their neighbors knew what they were talking about. Once explorers start bringing back to London, say, samples of botanical specimens from all over the world, the problem is, what do you call them? And different people call them different things. So there was no common nomenclature, and a very typical thing to do for a certain class of scientists who wanted to appear serious and therefore wrote in Latin, they would give very long descriptive names that went on for 1 or 2 lines. I mean, let's see, oak, whose leaves are moderately serrated, and which grows in a damp environment. That would be the way a plant, a tree, could be recorded in a catalog. It doesn't tell us a lot. People in France couldn't understand what those plants were in America that were being described in such ways, and so on. You get the idea. It was chaos. And out of this chaos, of course, the man who organized everything was Carl Linnaeus, who in the 1750s did the massive project of codifying everything and creating a system of binomial names, genus and species, Homo sapiens. Linnaeus went farther than that in organizing the universe of natural history by, in the plant world anyway, delineating 24 classes. And he did this by the sexual properties of the flowers. So class number 1, Monandria, I think, are plants with flowers that have only one stamen. So in order to identify something by his system, you have to know how many stamens are in the flower. His system was controversial, but in time it became universally adopted because the more people bought into it, the easier communication within a country and transnationally. The story I want to tell today has its point of departure when Benjamin Franklin comes back to America, as I said. This is a portrait painted by Peel, maybe in 1785. We're still not exactly sure. If anybody knows definitively, I'd like to hear about it. On December 5th, 1785, Franklin had already been home for several months. He was elected president of Pennsylvania in October. He was immediately reinstated as president of the APS. All this took place in September. Now, October, November, December, 3 months later, he receives a letter from somebody he had known years earlier, a cousin of John Bartram's named Humphrey Marshall. And Marshall writes this very long letter congratulating him on his election as president. He's a little late. And in fact, that congratulations is pretty much a pretense, because the body of the letter is a pitch for Franklin to help him realize his dream of organizing what Patrick Spiro has written so eloquently about, expeditions to explore unknown natural phenomenon in North America. Humphrey Marshall wants to do that in 1785, and he cannot get one person interested in that mission. In the spring of 85, he applied to the APS, turned down flat, not interested. He went to other organizations and got the same response. So the bulk of his letter to Benjamin Franklin is, I've got this idea. Would you use your influence to help me get funding? This is a very, very important thing to do. North America is filled with plants that are as yet unidentified, unnamed, and so on. Improperly described is something else he said. At the end of that long letter, he closes by saying, I've ordered my nephew, Moses Marshall, who was one of the people he wanted to send on this expedition. I've ordered my nephew, Moses Marshall, to present you with one of my catalogs of the forest trees and shrubs of our 13 United States, which I hope you'll accept and excuse any errors and imperfections you may observe therein. Okay, I'm so excited about telling you the background that I am going to have to whiz through the meat of the matter. For the entire year of 1785, Humphrey Marshall had been working on this catalog. Once again, he went to various organizations for help in financing its printing, and he was turned down. Nobody had any money. There were two things. People were not interested in botany, and also it was a period when money was scarce. The person who was his champion in this was Samuel Vaughan, also a member of the APS. Vaughan understood the importance of what Marshall had done. He tried to get various organizations, including the APS, to finance it, nothing doing. He then put ads in the newspaper, which ran for 3 months every week, trying to get subscribers. It was such a failure that I think Vaughan ended up subsidizing the entire project by himself. The subscription proposal said, as the title page reflects, this is an alphabetical catalog and botanical description of the forest, trees, shrubs, etc., which are natives of the United States, arranged according to the Linnaean system, with the English names also annexed, and an account of their appearance and various other things, with proper indexes, the whole compiled from actual observation by Humphrey Marshall. Now, this is the dedication page. Don't take it at face value. It's dedicated to the officers of the APS, none of whom helped him. When he wrote his letter to Benjamin Franklin, asking him to try to help get the APS interested in his project, I think it was at that point that he may have said to the printer, would you make a dedication page? Maybe that'll help me. The fact is that within, I think, 2 days of Franklin getting Marshall's letter and talking to Marshall's nephew, who delivered it, all of a sudden, inexplicably, in the minutes of the APS, you will find that the American Philosophical Society subscribed for 40 copies. My contention is that Franklin was responsible, that he, more than anyone else, understood the importance of what Marshall had done. And what I've done, and will just skim through now, is to compare Marshall's catalog with every other catalog that had come before it in the United States. I'm going to save these for later and come back to them. The Bartrams sent out seed lists, which they called catalogs. All of them were handwritten. Each one of them was different. This happens to be one from 1784, but they began in the 1750s. John Bartram, by his own admission, was not a scientist. He was a very eager, attentive, observant naturalist. But although he tried to use Linnaean names, he didn't succeed all the time, and the names in these catalogs are a little bit all over the place. Franklin in France fostered, during the war, encouraged the Bartrams to restart their business in sending seeds to Europe. And one of the ways he did this, maybe some of you know this, he had the Bartrams print a catalog of everything that they could offer. There are very few of them, and this is one. And then Franklin in Paris had it translated into French and circulated it. This created a huge amount of business for the Bartrams, and also Humphrey Marshall, who collaborated with them in the seed trade. I show you this just because it's so gorgeous, to give you an idea that in France as well as in England, there was a tremendous interest in gardening, plants, and botany. Quickly, who were Bartram and Marshall's competitors? There's a man named John Young, also from Philadelphia, and Young has a history which ends up putting him, although he began as a student of Bartram's, they ended up being competitors. John Young made an arrangement with the premier nursery seed company in Paris, who had him send over a list of what he could provide, and they published it in 1783. Franklin was still in France. This was the same time he got the Bartrams to send him his catalog. And here is a title page. There's only one of these known. They're very rare. Young's botanical knowledge was really primitive. So this is created more confusion than it solved. And a lot of people who looked at his catalog went back to the Bartram's list to see what it was that they could order. The other person who tried to be a botanist in early America was Manasseh Cutler in Boston. He submitted this paper to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It professes to fill the shameful gap in botanical knowledge in America, and he talks about how little there is known. But he too falls short, really dramatically short. And the names that he gives things and the descriptions of plants that he has discovered become, to some degree, laughable when you look at them closely. The order of his plants is also pretty much incomprehensible. So I want to quickly point out to you the highlights of Humphrey Marshall's catalog that Benjamin Franklin thought was such a major contribution. First, as he said, according to the Linnaean system, what Marshall did for people across America was to actually simplify a Linnaean system and publish it at the beginning of the catalog. It's great. And he did it in English. Number two, he arranged them alphabetically. Now, we might take that for granted, but no one had ever done that before. Alphabetically by genus. Acer are maple trees, they come first. Here is his description of the Franklinia. It was the first description of the Franklinia that was ever published, and so he's known for that. Also, as he said on the title page, an index. No other compilation of plant names or descriptions of plants had ever before been indexed. And he made an index of Latin names. And Samuel Vaughan insisted, which was brilliant, that they also include an index of English language names too, so that this could be useful for anyone in the English-speaking world. And now, may I read a short? We have less than 20 minutes for each for the next two speakers. Okay. Then, what I will simply do is thank you very much for your attention and tell you that in 1787, during the Constitutional Convention, Manasseh Cutler himself came to Philadelphia, spent an entire day in Franklin's home. Franklin showed him his library, and they took off the shelf an enormous volume of Linnaeus's most recent compilation with full plates and everything. They pored over it for hours, and Franklin said to him that he himself was not a botanist, but he always wished that he had studied it. What did Franklin do with Humphrey Marshall's catalog? It didn't sell well in America, but he sent copies to Philosophe and the Royal Gardens in France. 4 copies that we know of, probably more. Within a year, Humphrey Marshall's catalog was translated into French, translated into German, and the whole field of American botany was opened up to Europe. Thank you.
This thing on? Thank you all so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. I was realizing I hadn't been back to Philly since 2018, which is wild for me as an East Coaster. So it's wonderful to be here. And I also am, have to peep the exhibit because we're doing an America's 250th show at my museum too, coming up next year. So trying to, get some ideas from all of these revolutionary talks. This is a very in progress paper story for me. As happens, this was supposed to be the 5th chapter of my dissertation, but then of course it became 4 chapters, and this was like a coda because it didn't, I had to graduate and it had to be done. I always wanted to come here and do more research, so that was part of what I did yesterday. I would appreciate any workshopping you might be able to offer. So it's very much in progress. A huge element of moving this along was coming here, actually. So I'm going to be taking us to a period after the American Revolution and before the Mexican one. We're going to keep going on plants, actually. The story started with me finding a document on a royal decree from Charles IV, who was King of Spain at the time in the early 1800s, and he wanted guinea grass. There were many different valences that guinea grass had. It was in botanical significance. It was an old world plant, now known as Megathyrsus maximus, that came to the Caribbean, invaded along with slave ships and the colonists who were coming. They brought the seeds along with them. So it had an economic valence for the Spanish colonists because they used it for cattle feed. But it also had a cultural significance, weaving material for the enslaved laborers, a reminder of West Africa. It was a very useful plant. And it also had this strategic significance, which the royal order from Charles IV was requesting a bushel of guinea grass. And it also ended up being strategic for the United States because shipping this guinea grass from Cuba via the United States was a perfect vehicle for U.S. ships to enter Spanish territories. In comes Valentín de Foronda. He responded to this request for guinea grass. He was from Spain. He was Basque, from Basque Country, born in Vitoria in 1751. And he was the Spanish consul general and charge d'affaires in Philadelphia from 1802 to 1809. He was really in the orbit of everybody who was here. He was an economist, so he made an economic argument for independence rather than a moral one, which was kind of interesting. We'll come to that in a bit. And he was an APS member, which was why I really wanted to come here. He was elected in 1802. He was a friend of Jefferson. He corresponded with him about all sorts of different scientific topics. And he corresponded with Madison, who never replied to him, but that's fine. He was a prolific translator of French and German works on science to Spanish. He wrote on taxation, policing, meteorology, chemistry, vaccination. Actually, I found a really nice document in the archive yesterday that was like, vaccines work. So, okay. That he sent from Spain, which he was like, I'm very excited to report this. Please share this at your next meeting. So the official his official duties, he was really on the side of the Spanish. He was a classic imperial agent, but oddly, he was the first that, the historiography claims that he's the first Spanish agent to say, maybe there's an economic reason for us not to have our colonies anymore. And this is the front page from the APS collection of this pamphlet that he wrote, which he actually wrote anonymously, even though it's I'm trying to figure it out, because when I found it in the archive, he definitely submitted it and they knew he did it in 1804, but he published it under a pen name, Mr. DeFer, so I don't know. I have to look more into that if anyone has any ideas. But he's not entirely, so anonymous pamphlet, revolutionary idea, Spain give up her colonies voluntarily. But he's not entirely unimperial. He wants to take over Portugal. He says we shouldn't have colonies at a distance. They're really hard to take care of. Let's just, become a peninsular kingdom, which was a very interesting revolutionary view. But he also had his day job and had to comply with the royal request for guinea grass. So this is a letter of his that I found while I was doing my research for my dissertation at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, which was how I found out he existed. This one letter was in a whole kind of assortment of shipping of animals, plants, fossils. I was looking at how to reconstruct these objects of science that don't exist anymore, that had all these transits and were collected. And then I found this curious letter from Foronda. He's writing in the enclosed, he claims, were 20 bottles of guinea grass seeds from Cuba that were destined for Spain via Philadelphia from him. And in the letter, he's writing it to the Spanish Secretary of State, Miguel Caetano de Soler Ravassa, and he's saying, well, I'm really worried about the U.S. influence in the Spanish Caribbean, especially Cuba. He's taking advantage of the opportunity, his own words, that the guinea grass provided to get the attention of the Spanish Secretary of State. And within that, he also includes this list of ships that were going through different ports. So he has Spanish ships on the left and American ships on the right. And then you can see Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia. And so this is all intelligence he's collecting while he's in Philadelphia. And he's saying, this is from the first 5 months of 1803. The Americans' 58 ships were far outstripping the Spanish 29, showing that Spain was losing its hold on Florida and other areas that they formerly controlled. So if the United States' dominance in that region went uncontested, Foronda stressed, this is my translation of his words, Spain's commerce will die of consumption and these American men will get rich at the expense of the Spanish, just as clandestine commerce will increase in the light of day if it is true that France has ceded Louisiana to the United States. So Foronda's arguing that the power lay with the Spanish to prevent this sort of takeover. He's warning Caetano Soler, again my translation, that these states are the center of smuggling, that these are the true authorized ports, and the worst is that this smuggling is financed and supported by our colonies. For example, the governor of Puerto Rico continued to permit the United States ships to deliver flour there. Foronda suggests, wouldn't it be better for Spain to be given advance notice of such needs so that merchants can come to their aid rather than come here to the U.S. to make Americans richer? He was lamenting this and his fellow consuls' worthless attempts to curtail all of this subversion of Spanish control, but U.S. laws or lawlessness in his eyes stymied their efforts. Again, in my translation of him, there are purchases, there are transfers of ships, there are imaginary sales, there are imbroglios without end. But the irony of it all is that Foronda's letter had to pass through Havana before it reached Caetano Soler in Spain. So the middleman, the Captain General of Cuba, didn't mention any of Foronda's alarm regarding the maritime encroachment in the United States in his enclosure. his focus was solely on guinea grass, and it was ignoring really the more urgent subject in Foronda's dispatch, in my opinion. And now a little taste of what I found yesterday in the archive. One of my questions a question of research practice really while I was doing my work was, why is there very little English language scholarship written about Foronda? Where are his archives and in which languages? There's a ton of digitized online letters with his correspondence with in the Library of Congress with Jefferson, his unresponded, the sad letters to Madison while Madison was president, him not saying anything. But he always wrote in Spanish. His English was not very good, supposedly. Jefferson would write to him in English, and then Foronda would write back in Spanish. In the manuscripts I took out yesterday, there are some handwritten contemporary translations of his letters, even though Foronda also wrote lots of translations, not too many into English. But the correspondence I looked at yesterday, he was corresponding with John Vaughan, and putting his items into the library here. He says, John Vaughan, you need to be my mouthpiece to the governing body, the APS, because my interpreter, because I'm so sorry to be writing to you in Spanish, but I really need your help. But I think he had more knowledge of English than he let on, because this that I found yesterday was a very interesting pamphlet concerning the English and Spanish languages, where he uses it. It's not just a explanation of English versus Spanish, but he uses it as a mechanism, a political mechanism. So in this page that I include here, he's giving examples of like the English illegally board the Spanish ships, and then he compares that, and he's like, but in English it's written like this, in Spanish it's written like this, but it's actually not. It's just him showing the other two perspectives of the different empires, which I thought was impressively witty, actually. So I think his modesty about his English is a little bit, I'm not so sure about that. But I can definitely see how the way the archives have been stored, with having Spanish language stuff here, it limits the, it's very difficult for a lot of Spanish language scholars to get to the United States to do research. It's one of the things that I think about a lot when I'm doing my work, and wonder about the language and translation of science as time goes on. I think there's something to pursue here. So to sum up, this is the irony of imperial science, which I guess we've seen in many of the presentations today, is really, the Spanish had the goal of owning all the natural wealth in their colonies. They wanted that guinea grass. They wanted all of these different objects, all these different species of plants, economic botany, animals. They would send out their loyal agents like Foronda to collect these specimens and ship them home. But the reality was that these agents were influenced by local perspectives. And the result really is that kind of this very system designed to strengthen the empire contributed to its decline. This shipping, this infrastructure, this movement of objects of science actually contributed to the fraying of the empire. I'm arguing from this evidence that I found. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
I get to stretch, so let's make sure that you can hear me. You can hear me, right? Yay! Okay. So I want to thank everybody for making this possible and bringing me to this conference. I feel a bit like an interloper, as I'm not really a historian of science. And if Anna's project was ongoing yesterday, my project's done. So less than a month ago, UNC Press published my second book. Yay! Thank you. It's entitled Canal Dreamers, The Epic Quest to Connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the Age of Revolutions. And it tells the story of the 1820s race to build an interoceanic canal through Central America. It makes lots of arguments, but given the subject of this conference, I want to focus today on how 1820s canal dreamers envisioned the environmental ramifications of connecting the oceans. This story requires the broader context of my bigger project, like so many bigger projects we've heard about today. So I'm going to start with an overview of my book's subject and then focus in on a peculiar case of 1820s citizen science. So let's try this out. Since at least Christopher Columbus's voyages of the 1490s, Europeans sought a water-based shortcut to Asia. More than 3 centuries later, at the dawn of the 1820s, as Spain's American empire collapsed and new canals reconfigured economic life in the US and Great Britain, the idea of an artificial waterway wedding the Atlantic Oceans captured the imaginations of philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, political leaders like DeWitt Clinton, John Quincy Adams, Manuel Jose Arce, and Cecilia del Valle, as well as legions of capitalists from multiple continents, and here is British speculator John Diston Powell's. Every world or hemispheric map canal dreamers looked at seemed to suggest a predestined global shortcut. Squint, and the isthmus between North and South America disappeared. The construction of an interoceanic canal looked that easy. As one newspaper argued, the immense advantage arising from such an undertaking is apparent to everyone who looks at a map of the world. Western cartographic traditions that centered the isthmus led one author to command, "Let the reader cast his eye upon the map and behold its important geographic position. This isthmus appears to be the favored spot, destined by nature to be the heart of the commerce of the world." Central America was like a giant X at the middle of the map, a natural treasure just waiting to be dug up. But the isthmus was also an X when it came to information. To most foreigners, Central America was terra incognita. In the early 1810s, explorer Alexander von Humboldt proposed 9 potential interoceanic canal routes without having visited most of them. He never traveled to Central America. Other armchair pontificators narrowed these choices down to 3: the Mexican route through Tehuantepec, the Panama route through what was then Gran Colombia, and the Nicaraguan route, which involved traveling up the San Juan River, across Lake Nicaragua, and then a short cut through the rainforests on the western side. But it didn't show up. There it is. They go up the river, across the lake, and then they imagine cutting through. 1820s canal dreamers generally favored the Nicaragua route for reasons relating to diplomacy and topography. And from a distance, it seemed the most doable because there was already so much water there. The river, lake, and narrow land that could become water appeared to be a barely buried treasure that would require very little digging. The question was not if a canal would be built, but by whom. Leaders of countries and commanders of capital had to determine who was sovereign over this aqueous land to negotiate treaties, contracts, or both. The indigenous Miskitu Nation and the tribute-paying neighboring Rama Nation, whose homeland included the river, maintained on-the-ground power over much of the Caribbean side of the isthmus. But foreigners did not recognize their sovereignty. Few agents of capitalists or countries traveled to the route to negotiate. Instead, they raced to Guatemala City, the capital of the still-forming Central American Republic. Guatemala City was hard to get to in the 1820s, and for those unacclimated to the tropics, it could be lethal. For example, the first 2 US diplomats sent to Guatemala died en route. Nevertheless, by the mid-1820s, the newly independent and previously isolated capital was overrun with foreigners eager to invest in infrastructure. One visitor noted there were more European strangers, not Spaniards, visited Guatemala in 1825 than had been there from the conquest of Mexico. But by 1825, the age of revolutions had been raging for nearly half a century. The timing was terrible. Canal dreams arrived too late to be fulfilled. Too late, you say? I mean, didn't the Panama Canal get built in 1914, nearly a century later? From our 21st century perspective, it might seem like it should be too early, right? That all of this is happening too early. But we think about digging a tropical canal without mosquito nets or steam shovels as really a crazy idea. But we don't know what possible inventions they could have made in the 1820s if they actually tried. A civil war in Central America, a financial crisis in Britain, and the rise of partisanship in the United States prevented any construction crew from testing the limits of 1820s ingenuity. Canal dreams never had the chance to be technologically impossible because the political and financial context changed between idea and implementation. Too late, canal dreamers demanded capital from saturated markets that were already turning to coal and cotton. They sought cosmopolitan fluidity from solidifying nation states and depended on personal patronage as new political parties formed. And they imagined an investment in water when empires craved land. Even the water itself ebbed and flowed with an untamed seasonality ignored by would-be investors who did not conceptualize the re-engineering of the landscape as environmentally destructive. Plagued by timing troubles, as granular as the water cycle and as grand as political revolution, the canal turned out to be eminently dreamable, but entirely undoable, even for some of the world's most powerful people. The interoceanic waterway proved, frankly, too revolutionary for the age of revolutions. Historians often suggest that the Declaration of Independence launched the age of revolutions, but the era's end is much more murky. The timing of the 1820s canal quest teaches us about how, when, and the remarkable pace at which this era ended. And in the summer of 1825, as the Declaration of Independence approached its semi-centennial, Canal Dreams launched a historically interesting newspaper debate over the likely consequences of connecting the world's oceans. Envisioning an interoceanic canal as the culmination of the age of revolutions, most dreamers focused on potential financial and political profit. For Isaiah Duane, however, the waterway's imagined effects ranged beyond these considerations, far beyond. Born into a prominent New England family, Captain Duane earned a reputation as a daring naval hero in the War of 1812, and after the war, he struggled to find his peacetime place. A land speculator in Indiana in the early 1820s, he lost his first wife, who was a Philadelphian. By April of 1825, he was in Washington trying to get a job as a federal ship captain. Reading nearly daily articles on canal plans in the National Journal, Duane's thoughts drifted to the potential environmental effect of constructing an interoceanic waterway. He composed his ideas in provocative prose in a letter to A.B. Woodward, who was a territorial judge and a founder of both the University of Michigan and the Agricultural Society of Middle Florida, which I don't think existed much past 1825. University of Michigan, though, that's still going strong. In the spring of 1825, the Washington-based National Journal offered nearly daily reporting on interoceanic canal plans. Duane complained that in the paper, the importance of this great work is but slightly touched on, whereas previous writers had mostly considered the shorter route to Asia as the chief effect of the canal. Duane confessed, "My ideas on the subject go beyond these considerations." So what were Duane's ideas? Citing the British explorer Captain Cook, Duane asserted that the waters of the Atlantic Ocean were 19.5 feet higher than the Pacific. All right, I'll let that sink in. He thinks the waters of the Atlantic Ocean are almost 20 feet higher than the waters of the Pacific. We now know, like, sea level is sea level, right? But not in his mind. A topic of debate among scientific thinkers, Humboldt described the idea of the seas as anything but level as a, quote, vulgar opinion, derived from ancient texts. But the era's technology could not yet measure the relative heights of the oceans. In Duane's view, this height differential and the isthmus between the American continents that separated the oceans, that's what kept the Gulf Stream churning. When this canal is opened, he imagined, the rush of water into the Pacific will be immense. It will cut away the land, creating a passage for itself equal in magnitude to the Straits of Gibraltar, which of course separated Europe from North Africa. Ships would pass easily between the seas. But there was more to Duane's vision. It follows, of course, he asserted, that all those places on the Atlantic side of the continent will reclaim from the ocean all banks that have 19 feet of water thereon. In other words, sea level along the eastern seaboard would drop, and this would have the anticipated beneficial effect of eliminating dangerous shoals along the coast. The Gulf Stream, he exclaimed, will be done away, navigation rendered safe and easy. There would be no more shipwrecks along the Florida Reef, and travel to Cuba would be fast. Moreover, the sea level drop would feed the hungry United States with new land along its Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico coastline. Bye-bye beachfront houses. There's a new beachfront, right? But these are minor considerations to what I am now coming at, he transitioned. Duane's next prediction, the Mississippi River would suddenly gain a deep and safe mouth, and its unproductive and unhealthy marshes would be drained. Reclaim thousands of acres from the ocean, he projected, and make the states of Mississippi and Louisiana high and healthy. Meanwhile, a change in the winds would chill Cuba's climate, producing the same severe frost and ice that prevented coffee from growing in New Orleans. So, for Duane, the human action of cutting through the isthmus would produce enormous environmental change in terms of air, land, and water. Calling for the US government to accelerate its entry in the canal race, Duane closed his letter to Woodward, and Woodward penned his reply to Duane the same day. The Floridian judge suggested that the water differential, it might be smaller, perhaps only as little as 5 feet, and he was less optimistic about what benefits a fall in sea level might produce. I would anticipate severe deleterious sickness in the first instance, he opined, gradually succeeded by the consequences you mentioned, and eventually healthiness. He was willing to consider the destruction of the Atlantic Ocean's currents, but he thought that these effects might be diminished by the choice of route. If the operation should be conducted through the Lake Nicaragua, he wrote, perhaps the effects and results as relates to physical changes would be greatly reduced. With a plea for a canal through Florida, he closed his letter. And without wasting a moment, Woodward sent both letters to the National Journal. Duane's letter was printed on April 28th and Woodward's reply on April 29th. So here we have a theory of human-created climate change and a short reply advocating the Nicaragua route that begins their circulation through US newspapers. First printed in Washington in April, the pair of letters made their way to Boston by early May. Along the way, Duane's letter was translated into German and Reading, and then the responses started pouring in, arguing that the sea level differential had often been urged as a reason for not constructing an interoceanic canal. One response praised Duane's positive reframing, but suggested that the draining might produce ugly shoals, new ugly shoals. Newspapers around the country reprinted this critique and wrote others, which were themselves reprinted. Some responses critiqued the science behind Duane's suggestions. The contrarian Richmond Inquirer questioned whether the Pacific might not be higher than the Atlantic. This, too, it argued, would produce a marine revolution of a contrary and less beneficial effect than if the Atlantic was higher than the Pacific. Sure, they don't want their houses underwater. Sea level rise might be bad. Concerned by the uncertainty of a potential rise in sea level, the article asserted no time should be lost in ascertaining this important point of altitude. Even more critical a lengthy article written for a Salem, Massachusetts paper encouraged readers to rethink Duane's math. If the Atlantic were 19 feet higher than the Pacific, the sea level would drop by only half the distance, or 9.5 feet. Even this smaller drop in sea level, the author suggested, would have cataclysmic short-term results. Until the water leveled off over several years, the canal might be, quote, no more navigable than the Falls of Niagara, predicting that the longed-for waterway would temporarily be a waterfall. This critic favored the Nicaragua route, which was removed from the Gulf Stream and therefore would likely not interfere with it. But whatever the canal's location, the critic argued that humans lacked the power to produce such massive global change. It is certain, the critic asserted, that it is not in the power of art to change the Gulf Stream any more than it is to change the trade winds. Only a great convulsion, like the biblical flood, could have created the ocean currents, and only a similar force could make a deep enough cut through the continents to channel the Gulf Stream to the Pacific. In which case, he ridiculed, would not the southern part of the American continents float away or tip over? The fanciful imagery of a continent adrift implied that only God could stop the Gulf Stream's gyre. I do not know who Mr. Duane or Judge Woodward are, the Massachusetts author concluded, suggesting that both needed to understand that no canal was going to alter the divinely ordered environment. Others agreed. It is not within the reach of human power to disturb the economy of nature's realm. Condemning Duane's notion of human-caused climate change did not preclude supporting the construction of an interoceanic canal. One such critic explained, almost every great and brilliant enterprise has to encounter the ridicule and the opposition of the weak, the timid, and the selfish all over the world. Believing the art of building a canal could have environmental effects, Woodward and Duane were cast as starry-eyed dreamers. But with the same ink, critics who condemned the idea that humans could transform nature spread the dream of an economically and politically transformative canal. I'm going to skip that one. But the ink was what mattered. As more and more newspapers printed and reprinted first the coupled letters and then their many critiques, the idea of a transatlantic canal approached the status of a fait accompli. Speculations about the potential waterway's effects on the Gulf Stream were carried by the current of newspapers to the public in every corner of the nation, from Illinois to Arkansas, well into the summer of 1825. The high tide mark of 1820's U.S. popular support for an interoceanic canal, Duane's theory enjoyed a long news cycle and spread canal dreams across the country. The fact that these canal dreams did not come true is, in my mind, not as important as the fact that they were dreamed at all. The citizen science about the potential effects of a waterway between the Atlantic and Pacific would prompt research. The act of dreaming was itself a historical force. It is hard for historians to see the significance of something unbuilt. We tend to truck less in undoable dreams and more in the definitively done. The Panama Canal incontestably made history, but could history also be made of imagined waterways? I think so. My book, then, is not a history of failure. The 1820s quest for a canal only looked like failure from the perspective of dreamers like Duane and Woodward. For others, the dream of a canal could be a nightmare. To the rural Nicaraguans who inhabited the land that would become water, the Rama men and women who lived along the river, and the sharks who swam up from the salty Caribbean to the freshwater lake, not turning their homelands and home waters into the world's waterway, was a victory. My book tells the story of how the powerful can sometimes prove mercifully incapable of accomplishing what they believe to be predestined. If we escape the false binary of success and failure and instead take our cue from Columbus's unfulfilled quest, we need not squint to see the historical power of unrealized dreams. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent, okay. It was a great joy to read and then hear these papers by our distinguished panelists, and it's a reminder for me how far the historiographical conversation about the politics of science and the politics of science and the politics of natural history, I felt in particular, has come, right? We've moved so far past characterizations of science as innately apolitical. But we've also moved past characterizations, particularly I see this in natural history, less so in pneumatic chemistry, past characterizations of natural history networks as kind of simple tools of imperial inventory that straightforwardly extend the power of the metropole. Right? Imperial inventory appears in these papers, but they also provide this really much more textured and complicated vision of the relation between science and politics. So Dr. Cohn's paper, and partly I'm referring to the written paper here, begins in the 1780s with Franklin, whose diplomatic pull famously drew on his scientific reputation and built on his scientific networks. And she shows how Franklin, with Humphrey Marshall, does the work of kind of reconnecting commercial botanical networks that the revolution had disrupted. And that they did so actually using a commercial inventory, not an inventory for the state, right? That actually this is not the same, this is not the state's vision. Dr. Guenther's paper in the 1790s, one of the things I appreciated is he helps us see that President Adams' fear of the politics of science was justified. Yes, it was right. Scientists like Cooper and George Logan were genuinely attempting to overthrow things and disrupt politics. That was what they were going for, right? It feels like those cartoons should be lies. And the devil, I think, was not really involved. But they do have radical political aims. It's true, right? They hope that scientific societies would offer a model for political societies and spread new politics. And they are also using their networks really intentionally. And far from acting for a unified state, they use their networks to negotiate peace beyond the diplomatic reach of actual state authority. So Logan is using the same tools as Franklin for the same purpose with a very different effect and relationship to the state. Dr. Toledano's paper, the broader paper and the spoken paper, right, shows naturalists from the metropole who are sent to extend the power of the crown, classical inventory, but who are captured by and participate in a fundamentally Creole science, a science that was capable of considering dynamic living things in context. And in the case of Foronda, she shows naturalists participating in a Creole politics, right? Foronda uses his networks to move, or to attempt to move, not just Guinea grass, but ideas of independence. He uses his powers of observation on ships to make his case. Dr. Lepler's paper shows us contenders for political office, more in the written paper, whose whole function depends on contested natural features. She goes beyond the idea of imperial inventory in a different way. Imperial inventory describes landscapes that exist, and all of her theorizers are describing a landscape that does not exist and is not going to exist, right? Or from now, we can say it does not exist. So they are debating the potential cataclysms that might accompany an interoceanic canal, right? A landscape that would be created through politics and investment. And this is a sort of early debate about the Anthropocene, like an acknowledgement of the power of politics to reshape the natural world, or rejection of that power. I've written a few questions. I'm actually going to limit myself to one, and it's a question for all the panelists. And this is just a kind of nerdy history of science question, but I feel this is a nerdy history of science audience, so I'm cool with that. I was really heartened by how many people were like, yes, Bartram. Great. All of these papers, right, they predate, Jess's paper kind of goes a little farther, but mostly they predate the term scientist, yes. Term scientist is not going to exist till 1834, and in 1834 it's not going to mean what we mean. But this is also clearly a moment where across the papers, chronologically, new scientific identities and forms of credit are emerging, right? Marshall is a stonecutter turned botanist. Franklin is a printer turned, I wrote a printer turned everything, yes? Printer turned everything. Once I went to the APS and people were describing Franklin's inventions to me, and I was like, sounds like he invented everything but the jet ski. And it was explained to me that he also invented the jet ski, yes? I did not know. So good news. right? So they're these sort of transforming their identities a little bit. James Watt Jr. is part of the second generation of the Lunar Society, right? This is a different mode. Azara and Longinos have military and medical careers. People who are making claims about the interoceanic canal, many of them, I feel that they have an unclear relationship to expertise. Yes, particularly in the newspaper debate, yes. So I'm interested to hear from the panelists, in your period, what's happening to the definition of scientific expertise and to ideas or battles about it? So for example, is it something that comes with education or some kind of qualification? Is it something that comes with virtuosic performance in public? Is it something that emerges primarily, and I feel like I do see this in the papers, from networks and contacts? And then, is expert status in science for your actors a role or an identity? Or is it an accomplishment or a facet of someone? Is it supposed to have, and I think this is sort of the turning point, is there supposed to be a separation in the minds of your actors between the political self and the scientific self? Because we often look back and say, oh, look, the shocking overlap of politics and science. But how much of that is kind of anachronistic, yes, as a question? So that's my question for everybody. I'm limiting myself to one.
I'll go first.
Thanks, Jess.
Is this on? You've got it on? Excellent. Hi, everyone. My guys aren't scientists, really. I don't think any of them really think they're scientists. I think that the ones in Massachusetts who are critiquing these ideas are often in the whaling industry. And the ones who are writing these ideas, I mean, the Agricultural Society of Middle Florida, you know, those are some credentials, but I don't think they are the credentials of the other papers on this panel. Like, I think these are people who just think that they have the right to have ideas, and they live in a world where newspapers will publish their ideas, and their ideas serve political and financial ends for all of the people involved with them. So yeah, I don't think expertise should not even really apply to Humboldt in the history of interoceanic canals, as he never went there. And so whatever claims he may have to natural science in South America, like Central America, not really. So yeah, I don't think I've got any experts at all. The one guy who tries to go to Nicaragua in this moment can't really, to survey the route, can't do it because the civil wars delay him so late that when he tries to go into the forest in the rainy season, the local folks will not help him, and he's like starving and he gets eaten by insects, and it's lovely. Okay, so I'm gonna pass this along.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Jessica Riskin, one of my advisors, when I first taught Scientific Revolution with her, my very first class I TA'd as a grad student, she was like, there are no scientists before the word scientist. So I'm always very careful in all my papers about that. I would say they're naturalists, natural philosophers. And the one figure that I think has like some official expertise, which was my paper, the talk I really decided to dig in on Foronda because of the APS connection, but there's a couple other figures that you also mentioned. One is Jose Longinos, who was a surgeon, barber surgeon, taxidermist, who came on the Royal Botanical Expedition to New Spain in 1787 to Mexico, and he did like public exams of botany at the Royal Botanical Garden there, and everyone came out to look at the kind of like a big oral exam. So that is kind of the official expertise that I guess I could point to in the story I'm telling, aside from, of course, Foronda's official expertise in being an economist, and Azara, who's another figure I talk about in the paper, being he's in the army, but he's doing empirical observation. So I guess I'm trying to talk about this moment where anyone who does any sort of on-the-ground observation has some sort of expertise. And yeah, I think I agree, the separation of the political and the scientific is kind of silly in this sense, because if, the natural philosophy, I guess, included all of these elements. So Foronda, is not separating his views on policing and taxation from his views, I think, on chemistry and vaccination. I think they all jive in this worldview that he has.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I feel like the rise of the term scientist is kind of an important part of the coda of the end of the story that I was telling, which is by the 19th century, as it progresses, people have this idea of professional science and start to develop the term scientist. And most of the academies start to be very leery of any politicking involved and things like that. So the people I study, would use terms like improvers and naturalists. They use science very broad, the term science itself. But yeah, I definitely think that they do not see science as a profession that would be distinct from their political thing, but instead just as kind of people of the Enlightenment in that way. In terms of how I feel like there's a lot of performative elements that we miss today. So like where do they have the status as being improvers or literati or philosophers? I feel like a lot of it is through letters of recommendation. Like in a world where there's not face-to-face ties, having those letters of recommendation that says this is a person of humanity and letters and of science is really important. And the way people present gifts, gift giving is a huge part that historians of science have noticed. Franklin, when he meets Sir Hans Sloane, is like, here's this asbestos purse. I am a curioso. I am someone that is bringing a rare artifact for your museum. I have discernment and taste. Treat me like a fellow man of science kind of thing. So I think those are elements that I'm interested in. Yeah.
And how old was he when he did that?
It was his first trip. Was he like 27? I don't know. Yeah, something. Yeah, kid. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm focusing on a period that's earlier than any of you. And of course, there is no kind of self-awareness as scientists, but it would be very hard to talk about Franklin without acknowledging that he was so rigorous in applying what we now would call the scientific method. He never published anything that had not been tested and verified in as many ways as he could think of to do that. So as I was listening to the talk about canals, I thought the first question that Franklin might have had for these people who were writing in the newspaper, this would have been the perfect occasion for him to satirize these stories, because the first question I think, would have asked is, how do we know? How does one know that the Pacific Ocean, how do you test sea level on different sides of the country? Where does that notion even come from? The American Philosophical Society is to promote useful knowledge, and that was another one of Franklin's focuses. And so in the story I told, I think Franklin's interest in what Humphrey Marshall had done, I think what he saw in it and what excited him about it, was multifaceted. Number one, this was an opportunity. This was one guy, yes, stonecutter, who self-taught, like so many of them in that generation and the next one, who had very smart and had intense powers of observation, and Humphrey Marshall, obviously, and I don't know how, had access to books that some of the others did not have, and was applied himself enough so that he really absorbed that information and was able to apply it in a way that no one else had done. And his catalog translated all of that knowledge into, it's very Franklinian, into a way that could be easily understood by anybody picking up that book in America, at no matter what level they were. So I think he would have appreciated for the fact that one could help one's fellows by disseminating knowledge. the whole idea of transatlantic trade, also a very important aspect of it. And finally, there was this sense in the moment of 1785, when the country was trying to promote itself in the face of, frankly, a lot of bad press around the world. Franklin never lost an opportunity to send across the ocean any production that he thought would advance knowledge or point to an American who had done something truly noteworthy and remarkable.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions, I think. So I'm just going to look out for hands. Yes.
Thanks, and thanks for a lovely, really cohesive panel. And it struck me, Jessica, as you were making your really lovely closing remarks, that in some ways this was a panel about a particular unrealized dream, which is a sort of dream of science as a cosmopolitan practice in which there's a sort of universal language or universal set of practices that could be, as you suggested, right, a model for political organization. And that was constantly meeting with obstacles, right? Whether it was the obstacles of language, Anna, that you pointed to, the obstacles of politics, the obstacles of these very physical objects, right, that can't be transported. I loved the work you did in the paper on taxidermy and sort of what happens to the objects itself, but also in the botanical specimens, right, that where you can't see this thing over the course of its lifetime if you're actually involved in this timeless universal project. So I guess I would love to hear you just think a little bit about that limitation of cosmopolitanism, but maybe also particularly to reflect a little bit with us on what alternatives you all saw, because I think each of your figures saw the limits of this particular cosmopolitan vision. And I would just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about if they were offering up alternatives or remedies to the constant limitations to this particular vision.
I'll just go again. That's all right. I wrote the book already. I know the answer. Yeah, that's what happens when you're done, I guess. But so I think the canal dreams that my folks are thinking about are very cosmopolitan. Most of the people who want them want a more interconnected world. And one of my favorite canal dreamers from this era, who I did not talk about in this paper, but features in my book, is a man from Central America named Jose del Valle. His picture was up there very briefly. And he was a huge proponent of the canal until his political opponent won the presidency, and then he tried to quash his political opponent's version of the canal. But his arguments about why this wasn't the moment, and this wasn't the time, and this wasn't the plan, they all sort of show the sort of political thinking of the same cosmopolitan flip. So like you can be arguing for the globe at one moment, and then you could be arguing for your local context's need to not be taken over by other countries or not be taken over by the globe at another moment. So I mean, I'm not thinking as much about science as I am thinking about giant infrastructure projects, but I think the same folks could make arguments either way, and that's kind of interesting.
I'll say those giant infrastructure projects are science, you know?
They are, when they don't get built, you don't really see, when they don't get built, you don't really see all the science-y science. You see a lot of people thinking about what they might be, but they don't actually happen.
Yeah. This is a tough one. This is a great question. For Foronda in particular, I still am not sure. I think, you know, he was still, he went back to Spain in 1809 and died in Spain, although he did marry an American woman and had a son who, you know, spoke English fluently, supposedly. Who can believe these things anyway? For him, I think going back to Spain, was showing that his dream did not happen. He continued to send pamphlets to the APS after he was back in Spain. So I looked at some of those. He republished his pamphlet on the colonies, getting the what a prince should do with his colonies from afar, under his name in 1814. He was becoming a little bit more brazen about that, even though he was based in Spain still. So, he died before independence, right, just in 1821, just as that was happening. I think, at least in his case, I still have to research more, but definitely, I think his vision definitely didn't get achieved. But it does say a lot about the state of Spanish colonial control at that time, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, especially when I talk to my students, imagination is not one of the first words I think of when I think of science. And so I think I'm glad that you picked up on the kind of theme of the papers here about, in this revolutionary world, science was a place that generated lots of dreams and projects and imaginations. I have been working on one of these kind of schemes to develop a huge maple sugar industry that scientists are like, we don't need cane sugar and slavery. We can actually create free labor, and the Holland Land purchase is the largest purchase in American history by a Dutch conglomerate that's tied into this web that are we're going to make maple sugar and we're going to kind of get rid of the Caribbean, which is kind of a moral and political morass. So that doesn't come to fruition either. But yeah, I think remembering that science generates a lot of this imagination, I think, is important. To the flip side of the question, the material constraints, I think that's also important. I think a lot, why would people spend time when they have, we're all busy. Think about what it takes to pack these Guinea seeds, Humphrey Marshall and others, and part of that's a love of knowledge, but I think part of it maybe we can also start to think a little bit more about the social and economic, or the larger visions driving them, than just a thirst for knowledge to move us beyond the stock image that I think by 1850 becomes the scientist, of a cold, calculating empiricist. I think both what they mentioned, the material constraints, why do people do this, how do they struggle to do that, and then also how do they generate kind of these larger visions are worth remembering or reconstructing, and they're hidden in archives.
Well, just sort of working off of that, at the period I've been looking into, botany, certainly in America and also in other areas, it was a relatively new, as it was emerging as a science, even in Europe. It was far more developed in Europe than it was in America. It was basically undeveloped in America. But overall, botany began as a subset of medicine. The whole purpose of looking for plants was to find new treatments. There was just a fundamentally practical reason for examining these things. And in exploring all around the world, the idea was, what can you find that we can use to our advantage? What do other countries have? There's a cure for every list of plants. And Marshall focuses on this in his descriptive paragraphs as well. What can they do for us? What kind of wood is best for masts? What kind of wood is best for posts? What kind of oak is good for barrels? That's just the tip. What berries are edible, what are not, and so on. Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac, for all that, developed a technique for printing a leaf, which no one had done before, in order to show people in Pennsylvania what the leaf of a snake root, I think it was called, looked like, because it had certain medicinal properties that he wanted everybody to know about. So in America, people were very focused on what these plants can do for us, well, all over the world at that point. In terms of limitations, what came to mind for me, not only that limits of being able to observe something growing throughout its entire life cycle, as I talked about, but also in terms of categorizing the whole taxonomy issue, even knowing whether what you were looking at was the same as Catesby, for example, who had published a book on plants in the New World, decades before the period I'm talking about. But how did one know whether one was looking at something that Catesby had seen? You had to, it was a very, very difficult exercise. And a lot of people got it wrong. And I guess that's my point, is that in all the catalogs previous to Marshall's that I looked like, that were generated in America as opposed to in England or Europe, I was amazed at how much they did not agree. I mean, I just assumed that Humphrey Marshall's catalog would take as its point of departure everything that the Bartrams were selling. And I went to just compare. That's how I started this project. What's in Marshall's catalog versus what's in that big printed list of William and John Bartram's? I could not make connections between these names because only a fraction of them overlapped. And most of them I had no idea of what Bartram was actually referring to. None. And everyone who has worked on that catalog has had the same problem. Joel Fry published a wonderful article in which he did his best to identify these things. So the limitations in terms of identifying plant material were just enormous.
I think we have time for one more question. No, well.
Hi. Thanks so much. These were all really fascinating. I think I have a question for Mike. I was wondering when you were talking about the sort of political persuasion of a lot of these academic societies being, or learned societies being sort of full of radicals, I can't help but remember that John Adams was influential in getting the American Academy of Arts and Sciences chartered, right, in 1786 or so. So I wonder, like, if there's a sort of shift in political persuasion, or if it has to do with like the Federalist context of the 1790s, and then kind of corollary to that, is there any kind of like intersocietal rift among people of different persuasions? Because when you read about these like Democratic Republican clubs or societies for political inquiries, a lot of times it sort of is implied that they try to be nonpartisan in the beginning and then they kind of argue with each other and it falls apart. So I wonder just like what you found. I was curious about that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, and I'm cognizant that others in the room probably know more, but you're right about the American Academy of Science being seen as having a different political, the APS is, of all the kind of organizations, kind of considered and coded the most and having a political stance by the opponents of it. So,
Close.
closer, yes, so, sorry. Yeah, so the APS is seen as the most political. Part of what's happening by the 1790s is that some organizations, the Royal Society, John Pringle's removed as president for being too pro-Franklin, too pro-American. Sir Joseph Banks comes in and he, makes sure that Thomas Cooper isn't allowed to join and these others. So I think you start to see the trend of people saying, not that they're opposed to their politics, but like, if you're gonna bring your politics here, don't do that. So you start to see some learned academies doing that, which is why some of the more potent blends of science and radicalism go into private clubs than the pre-existing ones. So, and I don't know about the APS when that, or if that did take place. But so it's true that there are many scientific organizations that kind of try to be neutral in terms of not sponsoring political activity, even though I think most people see them as having spawned these spin-off organizations and clubs. So this group leaves the Manchester Philosophical and Literary Society and forms other groups right next door, to carry out their mission to France, Cooper and Watt, things like that. And then within the clubs, I think there's always a tension or a tendency to paint with a broad brush. And so I'm sure in these clubs, people joined Logan's agricultural clubs thinking they wanted to learn about Timothy or Clover, and then being like, there's some politics going on here that aren't my politics, and that they would drop out. And so I think this is a kind of, a tension or whatever. And but I do think that they start to sort pretty well over time, and that you start to get these groups of well-organized people. But what I'm particularly interested in is they seem to be able to communicate to other groups, so the ability to reach out, which I don't think is easy to do in 1790, to link clubs all throughout the East Coast, and then over to England, and then over to France, and stuff like that. But I do paint with a broad brush, and I think there was a lot more diversity, in some of these groups.
Thank you.